Today we're going to be covering another iconic coffee brewer in our series we call the Classics of Coffee. Now this might be a controversial take. This brewer is the Neapolitan, and it may be wildly unfamiliar to many of you watching, but today I'm going to make the case that this is an iconic coffee brewer, that it's worth celebrating, and I'm also going to make the case that before they fell in love with espresso, Italy was a nation obsessed with the single cup pour-over. Okay, so let me give you some context on this brewer. This is the brewer that was the most popular in Italy up until the mocha pot came along. And we've covered the mocha pot in a previous Classics of Coffee episode on this channel. This one here, is actually a modern one. This isn't like a vintage one found on the internet. This is a modern one. They still make them, but it looks pretty much identical to the ones that were made well over 100 years ago. If we trace the roots of this back, and we can, well, we don't start in Italy, we actually start in Paris. This brewer was invented by a Frenchman called Maurice. He was a tinsmith and a lamp maker in Paris. He iterated on an existing brewer, and that brewer was commonly known as the degli pot. That was a big deal, that pot, because it was a new way of making coffee. It was kind of one of the first pour-overs. It looked a bit like this, except you had an upper chamber in which you poured your boiling water. It had a middle section that held the ground coffee, and then a lower chamber in which the brewed coffee collected, and you could then pour it out. And that was invented at the beginning of the 1800s. Coffee, up until this point, had been made in a particular way that was pretty terrible tasting, I strongly suspect. We do have, records of the time. There's a guy called Count Rumford, an American who lived in London, and he himself iterated on the degli pot, but he describes coffee making in the early 1800s in London like this. Formally, the ground coffee being put into a coffee pot with a sufficient quantity of water, the coffee pot was put over the fire, and after the water had been made to boil a certain time, the coffee pot was removed from the fire, and the grounds having had time to settle, or having been fined down with isinglass, the clear liquor was poured off, and immediately served up in cups. For those of you unfamiliar, isinglass is a fining agent. You would add it to things like beer brewing. It helps yeast come out of solution and precipitate down, helps you create a nice clear drink. It's made from the swim bladders of fish. Coffee back then was a little bit weird. There are a lot of coffee brewers derived from that original degli idea. You can still get some today that are very similar, like the Carlsbad, which is a porcelain brewer that works pretty much identically. You could even argue that things like the Next Level Brewer or the Tricholate are kind of evolved from the degli brewer too. Maurice, with this, well, he had a very simple twist on the whole thing, which was a flip. I'll explain. In this brewer, you can heat the water inside the brewer. And then when the water is boiling, you can turn the brewer around, invert it, and the hot water goes to the top and then starts to filter through the coffee into the base piece. That was a pretty simple addition to the brewer, but it turned out to be incredibly effective. But now you've probably got another question. This French-made brewer, how did it come to bear the name of an Italian city? How did it come to be known as the Neapolitan coffee brewer? That is a good question. Now, we can look at the historical archives and there's things that we can see. Now, coffee came to Naples a little bit later than Paris, but by the early 1800s, coffee culture had definitely taken hold in the city. And in researching their book, Mauro, Carli and Enrico Maltoni did find references to the Maurice pot specifically by the middle of the 1800s. And then we know that by the beginning of the 20th century, it's definitely taken root in Naples. There's loads of references to it there. And that transition period is a little hard to unpick. Edward Bramah, who wrote extensively about tea and coffee things, he makes the case that from the 1860s onwards, Italy began its kind of unification process, and that created a much more kind of coherent domestic market for goods. And that helped with trade. And ultimately, people were no longer selling to little pockets of Italy, but they could sell their products into all of Italy. That may well have played a role here. But there's another weird and interesting name change that happens. So not only does this brewer come to be known as the Napolitana, or the Neapolitan brewer, but it has another name too, the Cucumella, which is a confusing name when you understand that Cucumella is a diminutive of cucuma, which means copper pot. So this thing was known as the little copper pot. But it's not made of copper, it's made of aluminium. And that's actually a really important part of this whole thing. This change to aluminium made it much, much cheaper. These today cost less than £20. They would have been cheap to make back then, cheap to sell back then. There are similar versions of this brewer made in copper, but they're kind of much fancier. You can look at things like the Potsdam brewer or the Russian egg. They're beautiful, they're ornate, but they were nowhere near as successful as this particular brewer. Now, I want to talk today about how this brewer gets its way into Italian culture and Italian film specifically. But before we get into that, before we get into the weird little hat this thing sometimes wears, because apparently Neapolitans are obsessed with the volatiles, before we talk about how I might make specialty coffee with this thing here, well, I should walk you through the basics of using this thing, and we should brew some coffee. Now, for this brew, I'm not going to be using this pot here. It wasn't very easy to work with. Actually, we bought, as you can see, a few different pots for this video, and we've had some issues along the way, including things that shouldn't be, like leaking spouts. So I'm going to use this pot, which has been my favorite pot so far, and I'll break it to pieces, show you how it works. This chamber, the little handle and the spout, is your collection kind of carafe point here. Most of the excitement's going to happen in this chamber here. Now, this is the kind of water tank. If we take this bit out, you'll see it's quite a clever little device, because this is going to sit in the water, and water will obviously be inside this as it's boiling up. And when we flip it, whatever water's in here is then going to pour through the coffee down below, making us a nice little pour over. So our base chamber is this one here. We've generally used the kind of line here as a fill line. There is a little tiny hole in the fill line here, and that's to stop this being a pressured vessel. So when the water boils and obviously steam is created, that can escape through this little hole here. It's also how you know you're really at the boiling point during the brew. For this one, I'm not going to use cold water. I haven't had a huge difference using cold or fresh boiled, so I'm happy to skip the wait time here. And then our coffee goes in this chamber here. So it's going to sit in there. And obviously when we brew, it'll be upside down, filtered by this piece here. Now, like a mocha pot, you can kind of work out your recipe by the confines of the water boiler and the basket itself. Generally, we found 90 grams a litre to be a pretty good thing to aim for. So the basket's pretty full, but it's not compacted in any way, but that's about the most we'd want to get in there. So 22.5 to our about 250 grams of water in the water boiler. When you insert your kind of coffee pour over bit, don't just slap it in there, because you'll just push all the water back out. So be gentle and just carefully lower it down. We're going to use a very gentle flame, mostly because the pot's quite small and the gas burner's quite big, but you want to be relatively gentle with this thing. You don't want a very rapid boil in that kind of water tank section. For what won't be the first time today, we're just going to wait. Now this is, I'll warn you now, a little bit messy. Water has to kind of come out because of the boiling to know that we're boiling. At that point, we're going to cut the heat and do a thing that makes me genuinely terrified every single time, which is grab it and flip it over. And so there's nothing to do now but take a moment and wait. Brews with this thing can take maybe up to 7 minutes sometimes, so it's a moment for a nice little timeout. Which brings us to this video's sponsor and a short ad for Headspace. Now, maybe you're someone who's heard the benefits of meditation, things like reduced stress or improved sleep or improved focus, but you haven't given it a go yet. Or maybe you're someone just like me who had heard the benefits, wanted that, dipped a toe, but struggled to really build a habit around it. For me, this is where Headspace came in and changed everything. Now, Headspace is a service that has so much to offer in helping you build a healthy habit around meditation. Wherever you are in your journey, there's something there for you. It might be that you're at the start and you want a bunch of beginner guided meditations. It might be that you want something more now. You want some walking meditations or some specific breathing exercises. There's over 1,000 different pieces of content in Headspace, and there will be something there for you to help you progress in your journey. For me, I've struggled with a busy mind, with being kind of distracted all the time, and meditation has really helped me flex the muscle of concentration. It's not that I necessarily want to work harder, I just want to be present when I want to be present all through life, to pay attention and really be there to enjoy the best bits. If you want to give Headspace a try, and I recommend you do, then if you use the link in the description down below or the QR code on screen, then you can try it for 60 days for free. Thank you so much to Headspace for sponsoring this video. Now, if you're really impatient, you probably can get away with, it's tricky, getting the water tank off, and you can actually see the water inside. Usually wouldn't need a tea towel to take this hot piece off. And then we can use the little hat or lid, and you've got your little serving solution. So, you probably want to know how the coffee tastes. It's actually quite reminiscent of mocha pot coffee. It's a similar kind of strength. It's a similar ratio of coffee to water. And I could see how people preferred the mocha because it was kind of quicker and the resulting coffee was a little bit hotter. Maybe they liked that about it. But it does feel close in style. Now, I will talk a bit more about brewing with this thing and my experiences brewing with this thing and try to brew specialty coffee with this thing. But before that, I want to talk about this thing's place in Italian cinema, because that's the bit that really got me about this brewer. In the 1967 film, Questi, Fantasmi, Sophia Loren, a star of a golden age of cinema, she spends nearly 2 uninterrupted minutes just talking about how to brew the Neapolitan brewer properly. That's like a really long time, and it's kind of fascinating to me that this deserved inclusion in the film. Now, Questi Fantasmi was written by Eduardo de Filippo. He himself is a kind of very famous, very influential author, director, actor, playwright, and he wrote Questi Fantasmi as a play. It was performed there in the 1950s. They made a film of it in 1962, and in the film, well, he delivers the coffee monologue, and it's like a 4-minute long monologue in that film, so clearly there's an obsession with this brewer going on there. Now, both of them highlight one fun little thing about this brewer. They highlight a little paper cone that goes on the spout here. It's called a cupertiello. The idea behind this thing is kind of sweet. They thought that the very first kind of coffee to drip through, the first liquid to come through, was the strongest, and you didn't want all those beautiful volatile aromas to just escape through your spout, so you put a little hat on the spout. And like I said, it's a lovely idea. I'm not sure it would hold up to blind tasting today, but it's a cute little thing. And actually, these kind of cones are common in other parts of Italy too, but usually they have like fried fish in them or something like that. Or in some cases, you might see cupertiello used to reference like a pastry bag or something like that. But in Naples, very specifically, it sits on the spout of your brewer. Coffee culture in Naples has clearly been a thing for quite a while. And I love the fact that that city embraced this brewer so much that other places associated it with them, because it's not the Neapolitans calling this the Neapolitan brewer, it's everyone else. They called it the cucumella, or actually a macchinetta, which is basically the machine. This was just the machine for making coffee, but it wasn't even the coffee machine, it was just the machine, which is kind of nuts to think about. Anyway, should you buy one of these things? Maybe not, no. I don't know if it is the best brewer, especially if you enjoy specialty coffee. Let me talk about a couple of experiences we've had trying to brew specialty coffee with this thing. Most of my problems actually are in the kind of coffee holding chamber here. This finer sort of set of holes here is the filtering bed, and that works pretty well. I don't have a ton of complaints. You'll get some fines coming through. It's not the end of the world. My complaint in many ways is actually this piece, because don't forget, it goes upside down. Now, when I'm grinding coffee to brew with this thing, at the kind of ratios that it's using, which is around 90 grams a litre, I need to grind relatively fine with sort of dense, light roasted coffees to have them extract properly. It's just a necessity. The problem there is once you turn this thing upside down, put it on the heat, a not insignificant quantity of coffee will fall through these holes because the holes are actually quite big. I know that Sophia Loren is kind of into a scoopful of coffee in the water as it heats up. I'm less into that, if I'm completely honest, so that was kind of a frustration for me in the brewer. But yes, going that little bit finer definitely worked to get a kind of more balanced cup. We did mess around by putting paper filters in here, both sides of the coffee, to see if it helped with filtration or kind of distributing water more evenly, but didn't really feel that there was an improvement worth speaking of. I can totally see how this would work really well with darker roasted, kind of more conventional coffees, but with specialty, it's definitely a challenge. In addition, you've got to be really careful when you heat this thing up. Be very gentle. We made the mistake, especially with one of these small pots, of being a bit aggressive, and while there is a kind of overpressure hole in the sort of water tank section, that was woefully inadequate for what happened next. But like I said, it's a fun brewer to play with. If you come across one in someone's cupboard, in a relative's house, dig it out, have a play with it, brew some coffee, be gentle. It is a ton of fun. And I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of history all around this thing that I think makes it earn its sort of place in the classics of coffee. Thank you again to Headspace for sponsoring this video. The QR code is once again on screen. But now I want to hear from you. down in the comments below. Do you have any tips and tricks for brewing with this thing that maybe we haven't found out about yet? Something handed down through generations, or maybe something you picked up yourself? Have you experienced brewing with this regularly? Has it been a part of your life? I would love to hear from you down in the comments below. But for now, I want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.